Mom told a Hell's Angel, "That man keeps watching my little girl." His response shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The late afternoon sun hung low over Maplewood Community Park in northern Arizona, casting long golden shadows across the playground. Children laughed as they ran between the swings and the climbing bars, their voices carried by a warm breeze that smelled faintly of dust and fresh-cut grass. Angela Brooks sat on a wooden bench near the edge of the playground, watching her 7-year-old daughter Lily chase bubbles blown by another child nearby. Lily wore a bright yellow dress that fluttered every time she ran, and her small sneakers kicked up tiny clouds of sand as she laughed without a care in the world. For most parents, it looked like a perfectly ordinary afternoon, but Angela felt something she could not quite explain pressing against her chest like a quiet warning. It started 3 days earlier when she noticed a dark sport utility vehicle parked along the far curb that bordered the park. At first, she told herself it meant nothing. Parents often waited in their vehicles while children played. Delivery drivers sometimes stopped along that road as well. But something about the way the vehicle stayed there day after day began to bother her. The windows were tinted dark enough that no one inside could be seen clearly. Every afternoon, when Angela arrived with Lily, the same vehicle was there. It never pulled into the parking lot. It never drove away quickly like someone in a hurry. It simply waited. Yesterday, Angela noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The driver's side window lowered just slightly, and a camera lens appeared for a moment before disappearing again. Angela felt the tiny hairs rise along the back of her neck. She gathered Lily early that day and went home, convincing herself she was being overly cautious. But today the vehicle had returned again. Angela tried to focus on Lily as the girl ran toward the swing set, her laughter echoing across the playground like music. Yet Angela kept glancing toward the street. The dark vehicle sat in the exact same place. This time the driver's side door opened slowly. A tall man stepped out and leaned casually against the side of the vehicle as if he had nowhere else to be. He wore a gray baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and dark sunglasses that hid his expression. From a distance he looked ordinary enough, just another adult enjoying the afternoon air. But the way his head tilted slightly toward the playground made Angela uneasy. His gaze never moved from Lily. Angela shifted on the bench and pretended to check her phone, though her eyes kept lifting toward the street. The man did not move closer. He did not speak to anyone. He simply watched. Lily climbed onto the swing and began pumping her legs with the carefree energy only children seem to have. Her braids bounced against her shoulders as she laughed and called to a girl nearby. Angela felt a wave of fear she had never known before. Mothers learn to trust instincts that cannot always be explained, and right now every instinct inside her whispered that something was wrong. Then something happened that made her heart nearly stop. The man lifted his phone slowly and pointed it directly at Lily. The device remained raised for several seconds, as if he were taking photographs. Angela stood immediately, her breath catching in her throat. The world around her seemed to slow. The laughter of children faded into the background as her focus locked onto that single moment. Why would a stranger photograph her child from across the street? Angela took a step toward Lily, but hesitated. She did not want to alarm the little girl. Yet she could not ignore what she had just seen. Angela looked around the park searching for someone who might help her make sense of what was happening. That was when she noticed a man sitting alone on the outdoor patio of a small roadside diner just across from the playground entrance. He wore a black leather vest over a dark shirt. A large motorcycle rested in the parking space beside him, its chrome reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. The patch on the back of his vest showed the unmistakable emblem of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The man sat quietly with a cup of coffee in front of him, observing the street with calm eyes that seemed to notice everything. Angela had never spoken to a member of a motorcycle club before, but something about the way this man carried himself suggested confidence and awareness. In that moment, Angela made a decision driven by pure instinct. She called Lily gently back toward the bench, took the little girl by the hand, and began walking toward the diner patio. Her heart pounded with each step as the man across the street continued watching them. When Angela reached the patio, she paused beside the biker, her voice barely above a whisper as fear and determination mixed together in her chest. She leaned slightly closer so no one else could hear her words. Then she said the sentence that would change everything that happened next. "That man keeps watching my little girl." Angela Brooks felt the last word leave her lips like a fragile piece of glass that might shatter if spoken too loudly. "That man keeps watching my little girl." The biker did not react the way most people would. He did not turn his head quickly. He did not jump from his seat or ask a dozen questions. Instead, he remained perfectly still for a moment, his large hand resting calmly around the warm ceramic coffee mug in front of him. The only movement came from a slow breath that lifted his chest beneath the black leather vest. Angela wondered for a brief second if he had even heard her. Then his eyes shifted slightly toward the playground without moving his head. It was such a small movement that most people would have missed it entirely. But Angela noticed. The man finally spoke in a voice low and steady like distant thunder rolling across desert hills. "Which one is your daughter?" Angela swallowed and glanced toward the swings. "The one in the yellow dress. The one with the braids." The biker followed her gaze without turning his body. His eyes studied the playground carefully. Lily was still laughing as she pushed herself higher on the swing, completely unaware of the tension building around her. For several seconds the biker said nothing. Angela could feel her heartbeat in her throat as she waited. Finally the man spoke again. His tone remained calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it now. "How long has he been here?" Angela shook her head slowly. 3 days. Maybe a little more. I noticed his vehicle earlier this week. Same place every afternoon." The biker nodded once as if confirming something in his mind. Angela expected him to stand up or call someone immediately. Instead, he lifted the coffee mug and took a slow drink as though nothing unusual had been said. Angela almost felt frustrated by his quiet reaction until she noticed something change in his eyes. The calm surface had hardened into something colder. A look that suggested he had just entered a completely different state of awareness. He set the mug down carefully and rested both hands on the table. "Do not look at him again right now," he said quietly. Angela froze. "Why?" "Because if he knows you are watching him, he might leave before we understand what he is doing." The biker leaned back slightly in his chair and stretched his shoulders as though relaxing. But Angela realized it was only an act. His eyes continued scanning the area through the reflection of the diner window. "What is your name?" he asked. "Angela Brooks." "My daughter is Lily." The biker gave another small nod. "My name is Marcus Dalton. Some people call me Hawk." Angela recognized the name Dalton from somewhere, but could not place it. Marcus continued watching the street without appearing to look directly at it. Angela felt a mixture of fear and curiosity growing stronger with each passing second. Across the street, the man near the dark sport utility vehicle shifted his weight and pretended to check his phone. Yet his head tilted again toward the playground where Lily continued to swing happily. Marcus leaned slightly closer to Angela and spoke in a voice that only she could hear. "Has he tried to talk to her?" Angela shook her head. "Not that I know of. But yesterday, he pointed his phone toward her like he was taking pictures." Marcus remained silent for several seconds. Angela saw his jaw tighten slightly. The muscles along his neck became more defined as he watched the street through the glass reflection. Then he asked another question that made Angela pause. "What kind of vehicle did he arrive in on the first day you saw him?" Angela blinked in surprise. "The same. One that is there now. A dark sport utility vehicle. I think it is a Chevrolet Suburban." Marcus closed his eyes briefly as if confirming a memory. When he opened them again, the calm expression had returned, but Angela sensed something deeper moving beneath it. He spoke slowly. "That vehicle has been driving past this park for 2 weeks." Angela felt a cold wave travel down her spine. 2 weeks. Marcus nodded slightly. "I noticed it during a ride through town last weekend. It slowed down when children were near the sidewalk. That is why I have been sitting here the last 3 afternoons." Angela stared at him in disbelief. "You were already watching him." Marcus lifted his eyes toward the reflection again. "Not exactly," he said quietly. "I was waiting to see if he would make a mistake." Across the street, the man near the vehicle began walking slowly along the sidewalk. His head turned again toward the playground. Lily jumped off the swing and ran toward the climbing bars with another child. Marcus placed both hands flat on the table and stood up slowly. The movement was calm and deliberate, but it carried a weight that made Angela feel suddenly safer. Marcus glanced toward the row of parked motorcycles beside the diner. Then he spoke a sentence so quietly that Angela barely heard it. If he is who I think he is, he just made the mistake I was waiting for. Angela Brooks felt the tension in the air change the moment Marcus Dalton stood up from the diner table. It was not a sudden movement or an aggressive reaction. In fact, the way he rose from the chair looked almost casual, as if he were simply stretching his legs after sitting too long. But something in the atmosphere shifted the same way the air changes before a desert storm rolls across the horizon. Marcus reached calmly into the pocket of his leather vest and pulled out a small black phone. His thumb moved across the screen with practiced speed, while his eyes remained fixed on the reflection in the diner window. Across the street, the tall man in the gray baseball cap continued walking along the sidewalk beside the playground fence. From a distance, he looked relaxed, almost bored, but Angela could see the way his head kept turning slightly toward Lily. The little girl had moved. From the swing set to the climbing bars where she and another child were laughing while trying to reach the top. Marcus typed a short message and pressed send. The phone buzzed once in his hand before he slipped it back into his vest pocket. Angela noticed that his posture had changed slightly. His shoulders were square now and his eyes were sharper, like a man who had just stepped onto a battlefield he already understood. "What did you just do?" Angela whispered nervously. Marcus did not look at her. "I asked a few friends to come keep an eye on things." Angela glanced toward the row of parked motorcycles beside the diner. Chrome and black paint glinted under the warm Arizona sunlight. "Are they close?" she asked quietly. Marcus allowed the smallest hint of a smile to appear. "Closer than he realizes." Angela felt a chill move through her, even though the afternoon temperature was still warm. She followed Marcus's gaze toward the street. The man near the sport utility vehicle had stopped walking and leaned casually against the metal fence that separated the playground from the sidewalk. His sunglasses reflected the bright sky, but his body language told a different story. He was waiting. Marcus spoke again in a voice low enough that only Angela could hear. "Take Lily and sit back down on that bench near the playground entrance. Act like everything is normal." Angela hesitated. "Should we leave?" "Not yet," Marcus replied calmly. "If we leave now, he might follow you. If he follows you, we lose control of the situation." Angela felt her pulse quicken, but she nodded. Marcus was clearly thinking several steps ahead. Angela walked back toward the playground entrance and called gently to Lily. The girl ran toward her mother with a bright smile and grabbed her hand. "Can I go down the slide again?" Lily asked excitedly. "In a minute, sweetheart," Angela said softly while guiding her toward the bench. From the corner of her eye, Angela could still see Marcus standing near the diner patio. He leaned casually against a wooden railing with one arm resting across the top, as if he were simply enjoying the afternoon air. But Angela noticed his eyes were no longer watching the street through reflections. Now he was looking directly at the man across the road. The two men locked eyes for the first time. It lasted only a few seconds, but the tension between them felt heavy enough to be seen. The man in the gray cap shifted slightly and pushed away from the fence. He began walking slowly toward the playground gate. Angela felt her stomach tighten. Every protective instinct inside her screamed that something was about to happen. Lily sat beside her, swinging her feet and humming softly without noticing the growing danger. Marcus remained perfectly still on the diner patio. Yet Angela saw his right hand move slowly toward the handlebar of the black motorcycle parked beside him. The deep rumble of an engine suddenly echoed from somewhere down the street. Then another engine answered from the opposite direction. The sounds were distant but unmistakable. Heavy motorcycles. Angela looked toward the road and saw the first rider appear at the far corner. The black motorcycle rolled forward at a steady pace before slowing near the diner. A second motorcycle turned onto the street behind it. Then a third followed from the opposite direction. Within moments, the quiet afternoon street began filling with the low thunder of powerful engines approaching from every side. The man in the gray cap stopped walking and glanced around with visible confusion. One motorcycle parked near the gas station across the street. Another stopped near the grocery store entrance. A third rolled quietly along the curb behind the dark sport utility vehicle. None of the riders spoke. They simply sat on their machines watching the street. Marcus Dalton stepped off the diner patio and walked slowly toward his own motorcycle. The sunlight caught the large patch across the back of his vest as he moved. Angela heard Lily whisper beside her, "Mommy, why are there so many motorcycles?" Angela wrapped one protective arm around her daughter and kept her voice calm. "It is okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "Just stay close to me." Across the street, the man in the gray cap looked around again. This time his posture had changed completely. The relaxed confidence he carried earlier was gone. In its place was something far more revealing. Uneasy fear. Angela Brooks could feel the air around the playground growing heavier with each passing second. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines had spread across the quiet street, like distant thunder rolling through a canyon. One by one the riders had appeared from different directions, each machine moving slowly and deliberately before coming to a stop along the sidewalks that surrounded Maplewood Community Park. None of them spoke. None of them revved their engines loudly or drew unnecessary attention. Yet their presence changed the atmosphere completely. Parents sitting on nearby benches began glancing toward the street with quiet curiosity. A few children paused in their games to watch the motorcycles gleaming under the afternoon sun. Angela tightened her arm around Lily as the little girl leaned against her side. The child sensed that something unusual was happening even if she did not fully understand why. Across the street, the man in the gray baseball cap stood near the fence, his posture noticeably different now. Just minutes earlier, he had looked relaxed and patient. Now his shoulders were tense, and his eyes moved quickly from one motorcycle to another. The street that had felt open only moments ago now seemed smaller, almost enclosed by the silent riders positioned at each corner. Marcus Dalton walked calmly toward his motorcycle without rushing. The black machine stood near the diner entrance, its chrome reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. As he reached it, he rested one hand lightly on the handlebar, but did not start the engine. Instead, he turned slowly and began walking across the street toward the playground gate. His boots moved with steady confidence against the pavement. Angela watched every step he took. There was something controlled and purposeful in the way he moved, the same quiet authority she had seen in experienced soldiers or law enforcement officers who understood how to handle dangerous situations without chaos. The man in the gray cap noticed Marcus approaching. For a moment, he pretended to look down at his phone again, as though he had simply been standing there waiting for a ride or checking a message. But his body language betrayed him. He stepped away from the fence and shifted his weight as Marcus crossed the street. When Marcus reached the sidewalk, he stopped several feet away from the man and folded his arms across his chest. The distance between them remained respectful yet deliberate. From the playground bench, Angela could not hear their voices clearly, but she could see the conversation beginning. Marcus spoke first in a calm, measured tone. The man in the cap responded with a small shrug as though confused by the attention. Angela noticed the way Marcus tilted his head slightly while studying the stranger. It was the look of someone comparing a face to a memory stored deep in the mind. For several seconds, neither man moved closer. Then Marcus spoke again, and this time the words carried just far enough across the quiet street for Angela to catch a few fragments. "You have been driving past this park every afternoon." The man in the gray cap laughed lightly and spread his hands as if the accusation were ridiculous. "It is a public street," he replied. "I can park wherever I want." Marcus did not argue. Instead, he nodded slowly and glanced toward the dark sport utility vehicle parked along the curb. The vehicle sat silent and still, its tinted windows hiding whatever might be inside. Angela saw Marcus return his gaze to the stranger and speak again in the same calm tone. "You pointed a camera at that little girl on the swing yesterday." The man stiffened slightly. Angela saw it even from across the playground. Only a subtle tightening of the shoulders, but enough to confirm that Marcus had struck a nerve. The stranger removed his sunglasses slowly. His eyes were cold and defensive now. "You got proof of that?" he asked sharply. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly toward the row of motorcycles now positioned around the block. One rider leaned casually against a gas station wall. Another sat quietly on a machine near the grocery store entrance. A third rested beside a street lamp further down the road. None of them looked directly at the confrontation, yet each one was watching. The man followed Marcus's glance and finally understood the situation. His confident posture faded as the meaning of the silent riders became clear. Marcus spoke once more, his voice steady and controlled. "I do not need proof to ask a simple question. Why are you watching that child?" The stranger looked toward the playground again, where Lily sat beside her mother on the bench. Angela felt her heart pound as his gaze lingered there for a brief moment. Then he turned back to Marcus and forced a thin smile. "You are making a big deal out of nothing," he said. "Just passing through town." Marcus took one slow step closer. The movement was small but powerful enough to shift the entire tone of the moment. Something in his eyes told the stranger that the conversation was no longer casual. Around them the motorcycles remained silent, but their presence pressed in from every direction like a closing circle. Marcus Dalton stood only a few feet from the man in the gray baseball cap, and the quiet tension between them seemed to ripple through the warm afternoon air. Cars continued passing along the distant highway, and children still laughed on the playground behind Angela Brooks. But the moment felt strangely isolated, as if the world had narrowed to the few yards of pavement between the two men. The stranger forced another thin smile and slipped his sunglasses back over his eyes, as though the conversation were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "You are wasting your time," he said in a flat voice. "I told you already. I am just passing through." Marcus did not move. His boots remained planted firmly on the sidewalk, his arms still folded across the front of his leather vest. The calm in his posture did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen enough to make up his mind. Passing through does not usually mean sitting in the same place every afternoon watching the same child, Marcus replied evenly. The man shrugged again, but this time the motion looked forced. "Maybe I like the park view. Maybe I like the weather. You planning to question every person who parks on this street?" Marcus studied him for a long moment without speaking. Angela could see the biker's eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were searching for confirmation of something deep in his memory. The man shifted his stance again, clearly uncomfortable under the steady gaze. Across the street, one of the motorcycles rolled forward a few feet and then stopped again, the rider adjusting his position along the curb. The deep mechanical sound echoed briefly before fading back into silence. The stranger noticed it immediately. His eyes flicked toward the rider and then back toward Marcus. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice tightening. "Some kind of intimidation act." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Nobody here is trying to intimidate you. We are just making sure everybody stays safe today." The man laughed again, but the sound carried no real humor. "Safe from what?" Marcus tilted his head slightly toward the playground where Lily sat beside her mother watching the scene with wide, curious eyes. "Safe from people who take too much interest in children that do not belong to them." The stranger's jaw tightened. For a brief moment the mask of casual confidence slipped, and something colder surfaced beneath it. "You better watch what you are implying," he said quietly. Marcus took another slow step forward. Now the distance between them was close enough that the stranger had to tilt his head slightly upward to keep eye contact. "I am not implying anything," Marcus replied. "I am asking you to explain why you keep pointing a camera at that child." The man looked away toward his vehicle, as if considering his next move. Angela saw his right hand slide slowly toward the pocket of his jacket before stopping halfway. Marcus noticed the movement instantly. His voice dropped lower. "I would not recommend reaching for anything in that pocket." Around the block the motorcycles remained silent, but Angela could sense the riders watching every motion. The stranger glanced around again, and finally seemed to understand how completely he had been surrounded without realizing it. His shoulders sagged slightly. "You bikers always think you are some kind of heroes," he muttered. Marcus ignored the comment. Instead, he reached into his own vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully and held it up just enough for the stranger to see the printed photograph on the page. Angela could not see the image clearly from the bench, but she noticed the stranger's face change immediately. The color drained from his expression, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. Marcus spoke quietly but clearly. "Name Victor Hale, 42 years old. Previously investigated in 2 states for suspicious activity near elementary schools and public parks." The stranger stared at the paper for a long moment before slowly lifting his eyes back to Marcus. "That was never proven," he said quickly. Marcus nodded once. "You are right. It was never proven. But that does not mean people stopped paying attention." Angela felt a chill run through her as the meaning of the words sank in. Marcus folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket. The street remained silent except for the distant sound of children playing. Then Marcus said something that made Victor Hale's expression shift from anger to unease. "I have been waiting 2 weeks to see if you would try something. And today you decided to step closer to that playground." Victor Hale's uneasy expression lingered for only a second before he forced his shoulders back and tried to regain control of the moment. The thin smile returned to his face, but it no longer looked confident. It looked defensive, like a mask placed over rising panic. "You got nothing on me," he said quickly, his voice sharper than before. Watching a public park is not a crime. Marcus Dalton remained completely calm. The biker did not argue, did not threaten, and did not raise his voice. Instead, he slowly turned his head and glanced toward the quiet line of motorcycles positioned around the block. The riders still had not moved closer, but their presence was impossible to ignore now. Chrome handlebars glinted under the afternoon sun, and the low idle of a single engine hummed softly in the background like distant thunder waiting to roll across the desert sky. Marcus returned his attention to Victor and spoke with the same steady tone he had used from the beginning. "You are right. Watching a park is not a crime. But waiting here every afternoon for the same child is not normal either." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You think you know something about me?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "I know enough to ask questions." Victor shifted his stance again and looked past Marcus toward the playground. For a moment his gaze locked again on Lily sitting beside Angela on the bench. Angela felt her stomach tighten as the man's eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long. Lily leaned quietly against her mother, unaware that the entire situation revolved around her safety. Angela wrapped her arm tighter around the girl's shoulders. When Victor looked back at Marcus, his patience was clearly fading. "Look, I do not need to explain anything to you or your biker friends," he said. "This is a free country." Marcus nodded calmly. "That it is." Then he added something that made Victor pause again. "But this town also believes in protecting its kids." Victor glanced once more toward the motorcycles along the street. One rider leaned against a lamppost pretending to check his gloves. Another sat quietly on a black touring motorcycle near the gas station, his helmet resting on the seat beside him. None of them looked directly at Victor, yet every one of them seemed aware of every move he made. The stranger swallowed and tried to appear relaxed again. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Marcus stepped slightly closer, just enough that Victor could no longer pretend the conversation was casual. "You drove a dark Chevrolet Suburban through this neighborhood 3 times yesterday afternoon. You slowed down near the playground every time children were walking near the sidewalk." Victor's eyes flickered for a moment. Marcus continued speaking calmly. 2 weeks ago, you stopped outside Jefferson Elementary School for nearly 15 minutes. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus watched him carefully. "That vehicle plate number has already been shared with local police officers," Marcus said quietly. Victor's head snapped upward. "You called the police?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Not yet." Victor stared at him in confusion. "Then why are you doing all this?" Marcus gestured calmly toward the surrounding motorcycles. "Because sometimes people think they can hide in plain sight until someone reminds them the community is watching." Victor's breathing became slightly heavier. Angela could see the change even from across the playground. The confident stranger who had leaned against the fence earlier now looked like a man calculating his chances of escape. Victor suddenly turned his head toward his vehicle parked along the curb. The distance was not far, maybe 40 feet across the street. Marcus noticed the glance immediately. Leaving already, Marcus asked calmly. Victor forced a small laugh. "I got better things to do than stand here answering questions from a biker." Marcus nodded once. That might be true. Victor took one slow step backward toward the curb. Marcus did not stop him. The biker simply watched with steady eyes as Victor turned and began walking toward the dark Suburban. For a moment, it looked like the situation might simply end with the stranger driving away. But then Victor reached the driver's side door and suddenly moved faster, yanking the handle open and jumping inside the vehicle. The engine roared to life instantly. Tires squealed against the pavement as Victor slammed the gear into drive. Angela felt her heart leap into her throat. The Suburban lunged forward away from the curb as Victor tried to escape the street as quickly as possible. But he had already made one mistake earlier that afternoon, and he was about to realize just how completely the street around Maplewood Community Park had been closed. The dark Chevrolet Suburban shot away from the curb with a violent screech of rubber against pavement, the engine roaring as Victor Hale pressed the accelerator hard. For a split second, it looked like the vehicle might break free from the quiet street surrounding Maplewood Community Park. The heavy machine surged forward toward the nearest intersection, its dark windows reflecting the afternoon sun as it gained speed. Angela Brooks felt her breath catch in her chest as she watched the sudden escape attempt. Parents nearby began pulling their children closer, startled by the sound of the engine. Lily looked up at her mother with wide eyes, confused by the sudden tension spreading across the playground. Angela held her tightly and whispered softly that everything was going to be all right, though her heart was pounding so loudly she could feel it in her ears. But Victor Hale had not realized something very important about the quiet motorcycles that had appeared around the block. They had not arrived randomly. They had been placed with careful purpose. As the Suburban raced toward the corner of Maple Street, the rider who had been sitting calmly beside the gas station straightened up and swung onto his motorcycle. The engine ignited with a deep thunder that vibrated through the ground. At the same moment, another rider farther down the road rolled forward and angled his machine across part of the lane. Victor saw it too late. The Suburban slowed abruptly as the motorcycle blocked the turn just enough to force the large vehicle to brake. Tires squealed again as Victor jerked the wheel and tried to steer around the obstacle. But the moment he hesitated, another motorcycle moved forward from the opposite side of the intersection, stopping directly in the path he had been aiming for. The street that had seemed wide open only seconds earlier now felt narrow and controlled. Marcus Dalton had not chased the vehicle. Instead, he remained standing calmly on the sidewalk near the playground gate, watching the situation unfold exactly as he expected. The roar of engines echoed through the neighborhood as two more motorcycles rolled slowly forward from behind the Suburban, cutting off the direction Victor had just come from. The large vehicle lurched to a halt in the center of the road, trapped in a loose but unmistakable circle of heavy machines. None of the riders rushed. None of them acted recklessly. They simply sat on their motorcycles with the calm patience of people who had already decided the outcome. Victor gripped the steering wheel inside the Suburban and looked around wildly. Angela could see his silhouette through the front windshield as his head turned quickly from one direction to another. The man who had stood confidently beside the playground fence earlier now looked completely different. Panic had replaced arrogance. One of the riders removed his helmet slowly and rested it on the fuel tank of his motorcycle while keeping his eyes fixed on the vehicle. Another rider folded his arms across his chest as he leaned against the handlebar of a large touring bike. The engines rumbled softly like distant thunder waiting to break. Marcus finally stepped away from the playground entrance and walked toward the stalled Suburban. His pace was steady and unhurried. Angela watched him cross the street again with the same controlled confidence he had shown from the beginning. As Marcus approached the driver's side door, Victor lowered the window halfway and shouted something angrily, but his voice carried a note of fear that had not been there before. "You cannot block a public road like this," he snapped. Marcus stopped beside the vehicle and rested one hand lightly on the edge of the open window frame. His expression remained calm. "Nobody is blocking anything," Marcus replied quietly. "We are just making sure you stay long enough for a proper conversation." Victor shook his head violently. "Move these motorcycles right now." Marcus looked around at the riders positioned along the street. The men remained still, watching silently. Marcus returned his attention to Victor and spoke again. "You tried to leave very quickly for someone who said he was simply enjoying the view of a park." Victor opened his mouth, but hesitated. Marcus leaned slightly closer to the window and lowered his voice so only Victor could hear the next words. "The police officers in this county are already on their way. I called them the moment you reached for your car door." Victor's face drained of color. Angela could see it clearly even from the bench across the playground. Marcus straightened and stepped back from the vehicle just as the distant sound of sirens began to echo faintly through the warm Arizona afternoon air. The faint wail of approaching sirens drifted through the warm Arizona air and slowly grew louder with each passing second. The sound echoed off the quiet buildings surrounding Maplewood Community Park and rolled down the street like a warning that the situation was about to change. Victor Hale heard it too. Inside the dark Chevrolet Suburban, his eyes widened and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. The thin layer of control he had tried to hold onto moments earlier was clearly gone now. Panic had begun to settle into his movements. Marcus Dalton stood calmly beside the vehicle, his posture steady and composed as though the arrival of law enforcement had been expected from the very beginning. Around the Suburban, the motorcycles remained in place, their engines idling softly. The riders did not celebrate or shout. They simply waited with the patience of men who understood that the next step belonged to the authorities. Victor leaned forward slightly in his seat and looked past Marcus toward the approaching road where the sirens continued growing louder. You called them already, he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus nodded once. I told you earlier this afternoon that people in this town pay attention when someone behaves strangely around children. Victor shook his head slowly and glanced at the motorcycles surrounding him. You bikers think you run the streets now, he said bitterly. Marcus did not react to the insult. Instead, he rested one hand lightly on the side of the Suburban and looked through the open driver window with quiet focus. Nobody here runs the streets, Marcus replied calmly. But we do make sure children in our community stay safe. Victor turned his head sharply toward the playground again. Angela Brooks still sat on the bench holding Lily close beside her. The little girl watched the motorcycles with curiosity, but did not fully understand the reason for the tension. Angela met Marcus's eyes across the street for a brief moment, and he gave a small reassuring nod that seemed to calm her slightly. Victor noticed the exchange and frowned. You do not even know those people, he said sharply. Marcus looked back at him. I do not have to know them to understand that a child deserves to play in a park without being watched by a stranger who has been investigated in 2 different states. Victor's jaw tightened again. That investigation went nowhere, he snapped. Marcus nodded calmly. That is true, but sometimes investigations take time. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the sirens had grown much louder now. A pair of county police cruisers turned onto Maple Street at the far intersection, their red and blue lights flashing brightly in the afternoon sun. The vehicles slowed as they approached the group of motorcycles surrounding the Suburban. Several nearby residents had stepped outside their homes to watch the unusual scene unfold. Parents at the playground had begun guiding their children toward the opposite side of the park, giving the police more space as they arrived. The first cruiser stopped about 30 feet from the Suburban, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out carefully, scanning the situation before approaching. Marcus stepped back from the vehicle immediately, raising both hands slightly to show he was not interfering. The motorcycles remained still as the officers walked forward. One of the officers glanced briefly at Marcus and then at the line of riders surrounding the street. Looks like you already have the situation contained, the officer said calmly. Marcus gave a small nod. We were just making sure he stayed long enough for you to arrive. The second officer moved toward the driver's side window of the Suburban, while the first officer positioned himself near the front of the vehicle. Victor sat rigidly behind the steering wheel, his earlier confidence completely gone. Sir, the officer said firmly through the open window. Please turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. Victor hesitated for a moment, but the circle of motorcycles and flashing patrol lights made his situation painfully clear. Slowly he reached forward and switched off the engine. The sudden silence that followed felt heavy after the constant rumble of machinery. Victor pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement with visible reluctance. As the officer guided him away from the vehicle, Marcus turned his head slightly toward the Suburban and studied it with careful attention. Something about the vehicle still bothered him. He could not yet explain exactly why, but he had learned long ago to trust the feeling that came when a situation was not finished revealing its truth. Victor Hale stood beside the dark Chevrolet Suburban with his hands resting stiffly at his sides while one of the county police officers guided him a few steps away from the driver's side door. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cruisers reflected across the polished chrome of the motorcycles and bounced off the windows of nearby houses, turning the quiet neighborhood street into a scene that felt both tense and strangely controlled. The second officer had already moved toward the front of the vehicle, speaking calmly into a radio attached to his shoulder while keeping a careful eye on Victor. Around them, the riders from the motorcycle club remained exactly where they had positioned themselves earlier. None of them interfered with the officers, and none of them attempted to approach Victor. They simply stood beside their machines like silent witnesses to the situation that had unfolded. Marcus Dalton stepped a few feet back from the Suburban so the officers had clear space to work. His arms were relaxed at his sides, but his attention never left the vehicle. Something about the scene continued to trouble him. He watched carefully as the first officer spoke to Victor in a firm but controlled voice. Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity near the playground. We need to ask you a few questions. Victor forced a tired smile as if trying to make the entire situation sound ridiculous. I already told that biker there, he said while nodding toward Marcus. I was just parked here enjoying the view. That is not illegal. The officer nodded slightly. You are correct that it is not illegal to park on a public street. However, several people reported that you appeared to be photographing children on the playground. Victor's expression hardened. That is a serious accusation, he said quickly. The officer remained calm. That is why we are here to clarify what happened. While the conversation continued, Marcus slowly walked toward the rear of the Suburban, his eyes scanning the vehicle carefully. The officer near the front noticed him and raised a hand politely. Please stay clear of the vehicle for now, sir. Marcus stopped immediately and nodded respectfully. Of course, officer. He stepped back again, but his attention remained fixed on the vehicle. The rear window of the Suburban was dark with heavy tint, making it impossible to see clearly inside. Yet Marcus could not shake the feeling that something about the vehicle was wrong. Angela Brooks watched everything from the playground bench while holding Lily close beside her. Several other parents stood nearby now, whispering quietly as they tried to understand what had happened. Lily leaned against her mother and watched the flashing police lights with fascination, still too young to grasp how serious the situation might be. Angela gently brushed a braid away from the girl's face and tried to keep her voice calm as she spoke softly to reassure her. Across the street, the officer speaking with Victor asked another question. Sir, do you have a phone or camera inside the vehicle? Victor hesitated for a brief moment before answering. Just my phone. Nothing else. The officer nodded. For the moment, please remain here while we verify a few things. Victor glanced nervously toward the Suburban and then back toward the officer. Marcus noticed the movement instantly. That small glance confirmed the uneasy feeling he had been carrying since the vehicle first appeared at the park. Something inside that Suburban mattered to Victor more than he wanted anyone to realize. The officer near the front of the vehicle opened the passenger side door slightly and leaned inside to check the interior. After only a few seconds, he straightened and looked toward his partner. So you may want to take a look at this, he said in a more serious tone. The first officer walked over quickly and peered through the open door. Angela saw the officer's posture stiffen almost immediately. Marcus took a slow step forward before stopping again, careful not to interfere. The officers spoke quietly to each other for a moment before one of them turned toward Victor with a much firmer expression. So you told us there was only a phone in this vehicle. Victor swallowed and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. What are you talking about? He said defensively. The officer stepped aside just enough to reveal what he had seen on the passenger seat. A large professional camera rested there with a long zoom lens pointed toward the playground through the front windshield. Several memory cards and a notebook lay beside it. Marcus felt the uneasy certainty settle into his chest. The man had not been watching the park by accident. He had been documenting it. The discovery of the professional camera on the passenger seat changed the atmosphere on Maple Street immediately. The officer, standing beside the open door, studied the equipment carefully while his partner remained beside Victor Hale, watching the man's reaction closely. The long zoom lens pointed forward through the windshield like a silent witness, its direction aimed straight toward the playground where children had been playing only minutes earlier. Several memory cards rested beside the camera along with a worn notebook filled with pages of small handwritten notes. The officer near the door lifted the notebook carefully and flipped through several pages. His expression tightened as he scanned the writing. Across the street, Angela Brooks felt a cold wave pass through her chest as she saw the officer's reaction. Lily leaned against her shoulder and whispered softly, asking why the police were looking inside the vehicle. Angela gently brushed her daughter's hair and told her everything was going to be fine. Though her voice carried a tension she could not completely hide. On the street, the officer closed the notebook and stepped toward Victor with a much firmer expression than before. So you told us there was nothing in this vehicle except a phone. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward the camera before returning to the officer. It is just photography equipment, he said quickly. I am a freelance photographer. The officer nodded slowly but did not appear convinced. Then why are there detailed notes about the times children arrive at this park and the days they usually play here? Victor's mouth opened slightly, but no immediate answer came. Marcus Dalton stood several feet away beside the Suburban, watching the exchange carefully. His earlier suspicion had now hardened into something more certain. Victor had not simply been watching the park. He had been studying it. The second officer stepped forward and looked again at the notebook pages. These notes list several playgrounds in neighboring towns, he said quietly to his partner. And there are descriptions of specific children. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Victor shifted uncomfortably and tried to laugh. That is research for a photography project, he said quickly. I take pictures of everyday community life. The officer beside him remained silent for a moment before speaking again. A photography project usually involves asking permission before documenting children this closely. Victor's jaw tightened again. Marcus could see the panic slowly returning to the man's eyes. The officer near the Suburban turned back toward the open passenger door and carefully lifted one of the memory cards from the seat. We will need to examine the contents of this equipment, he said calmly. Victor stepped forward suddenly, but the officer beside him raised a hand and stopped him immediately. Please remain where you are, sir. Victor hesitated and then stepped back again. His breathing had become noticeably heavier now. The calm mask he had tried to maintain earlier was completely gone. Marcus folded his arms across his chest and watched silently. The sirens from the patrol cruisers had faded now, but the flashing lights still reflected across the quiet street and the line of motorcycles surrounding the scene. Parents at the playground had moved farther away with their children, though many of them continued watching from a safe distance. The officer near the Suburban spoke into his radio briefly before turning back toward Victor. Sir, based on the items we have located inside your vehicle, we are going to need you to accompany us to the station for further questioning. Victor's head snapped upward. You cannot do that without evidence, he said sharply. The officer remained calm. The equipment and written records inside this vehicle are enough to justify an investigation. Victor looked toward the playground again, and then toward the motorcycles surrounding the street. His eyes finally settled on Marcus. For a moment, anger flashed across his face. You set this whole thing up, he muttered. Marcus did not react. He simply looked back at Victor with the same calm expression he had held since the beginning of the afternoon. The officer gently took hold of Victor's arm and guided him toward the patrol cruiser waiting near the curb. As Victor was escorted away, Marcus glanced once more at the Suburban and the camera resting inside. The truth about what Victor had been planning was still unfolding. But one thing had already become clear. The quiet afternoon at Maplewood Community Park could have ended very differently if someone had not been paying attention. Victor Hale sat stiffly in the back seat of the patrol cruiser while the officer closed the door and stepped away. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the dark windows of the vehicle as the quiet street slowly began returning to normal. Yet the tension in the air had not disappeared. The discovery inside the Suburban had changed everything. The second officer remained near the open passenger door of the vehicle, carefully placing the camera, the memory cards, and the notebook into an evidence bag while speaking quietly into his radio. Marcus Dalton stood a few steps away beside the curb, watching the process with the same steady calm he had carried throughout the afternoon. One by one, the riders from the motorcycle club began shutting off their engines completely, the deep rumble fading into silence as the situation came under official control. Parents across the playground continued watching from a distance while guiding their children away from the street. Angela Brooks remained seated on the bench with Lily beside her, still holding the girl close. Lily looked up at her mother and asked in a soft voice if the man was going to be in trouble. Angela brushed a hand gently across her daughter's hair and answered carefully that the police officers were simply making sure everyone was safe. Across the street, the officer who had spoken with Victor earlier walked back toward Marcus. The man studied the Suburban for a moment before speaking. You were the one who called this in, he asked. Marcus nodded once. I saw the vehicle slowing down near the playground earlier this week. Today he finally stepped out and started moving closer to the fence. The officer looked toward the playground where several children were still standing beside their parents. Good call staying alert, he said quietly. That camera and those notes suggest he was documenting patterns. Marcus folded his arms across his chest again and glanced briefly toward the evidence bag, now resting on the hood of the patrol cruiser. The officer followed his gaze and lowered his voice slightly. We will need to examine the memory cards carefully, but from the notes we saw, it looks like he had been tracking several locations around this county. Marcus nodded slowly. I had the same feeling. The officer looked back toward the cruiser where Victor sat behind the glass, his head lowered as if realizing the weight of the situation. Sometimes people think they can move from town to town without anyone noticing patterns, the officer said quietly. But when someone starts keeping records like that, it usually means they were planning something. Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply watched the cruiser for a moment, then turned his eyes back toward the playground. Lily had stepped down from the bench and was standing beside Angela holding her hand. The girl waved shyly toward Marcus when she noticed him looking in her direction. Marcus lifted one hand and gave a small friendly wave in return. The officer noticed the exchange and allowed himself a brief smile. "Looks like she trusts you already," he said. Marcus shrugged lightly. Kids can usually tell when someone is trying to protect them. A second patrol vehicle pulled onto the street a few minutes later, and another officer stepped out to assist with the investigation. The Suburban was prepared to be towed for a full search, while the evidence bags were carefully secured in the back of the first cruiser. Marcus watched the process quietly until the officer beside him spoke again. "I appreciate the way you and your friends handled this today," he said. "You kept him here without escalating the situation." Marcus glanced briefly at the row of motorcycles still parked along the curb. "Nobody wanted trouble," he replied calmly. "We just wanted to make sure he did not leave before you arrived." The officer nodded once and extended his hand. Marcus shook it firmly. As the patrol cruiser began pulling away with Victor Hale inside, the quiet neighborhood street slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But for the families at Maplewood Community Park, the afternoon would not be forgotten. They had witnessed how quickly an ordinary day could turn dangerous and how important it was when someone decided to pay attention. The patrol cruiser carrying Victor Hale disappeared around the far corner of Maple Street, with its lights still flashing softly against the quiet buildings. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood again. For the first time since the confrontation began, the street outside Maplewood Community Park felt peaceful. The second cruiser remained parked near the curb while the officers finished documenting the scene. The Suburban had already been attached to a tow truck, its large frame lifted slowly from the pavement as evidence technicians prepared to transport it for a full inspection. Marcus Dalton stood beside the row of motorcycles with his hands resting loosely at his sides. One by one, the riders who had quietly formed the protective circle earlier in the afternoon began preparing to leave. Engine started again, but this time the sound carried a relaxed tone rather than tension. The riders nodded to Marcus as they passed him, some giving a quick wave before guiding their motorcycles toward the open road. None of them stayed for praise or recognition. They had arrived when they were needed, and now they were simply returning to their own lives. Across the playground, Angela Brooks finally stood up from the bench while holding Lily's hand. For several minutes, she had watched the police officers and the motorcycles from a distance, still trying to process everything that had happened so quickly. Now that the danger had passed, she walked slowly toward Marcus. Lily skipped beside her, her curiosity stronger than her fear. When they reached the edge of the sidewalk, Marcus noticed them approaching and turned with a small, welcoming smile. Angela paused for a moment before speaking, clearly unsure how to express what she was feeling. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly. Marcus shook his head gently. "You already did the right thing when you spoke up." Angela glanced toward the empty street where the patrol cruiser had disappeared. "I almost convinced myself I was imagining things earlier," she admitted. "I kept thinking maybe I was just being overly protective." Marcus nodded slowly as if he had heard that story many times before. "Parents are supposed to notice when something feels wrong," he replied. "That instinct exists for a reason." Lily stepped slightly forward and looked up at Marcus with wide eyes. "Were you the one who stopped the bad man?" she asked softly. Angela looked embarrassed for a moment, but Marcus crouched down to the girl's level so they could speak face to face. "A lot of people helped today," he answered calmly. "Your mother noticed something important. The police officers came quickly, and a few friends of mine made sure nobody got hurt while we waited." Lily considered the explanation carefully and then smiled. "My mother says heroes help people when nobody else notices," she said proudly. Marcus chuckled quietly and stood again. "Sometimes helping just means paying attention," he said. Angela watched the exchange with gratitude shining clearly in her eyes. The officer who had spoken with Marcus earlier approached again from the cruiser and gave a brief nod toward Angela. "Ma'am, we will contact you if we need a statement later," he explained politely. "For now, everything appears under control." Angela thanked him sincerely before the officer returned to his vehicle. The last tow truck pulled away with the Suburban a few minutes later, leaving the street completely clear again. Children slowly returned to the playground equipment as parents reassured them that everything was safe. The warm Arizona sun still hung above the park, casting long golden light across the swings and climbing bars just as it had earlier that afternoon. Marcus walked back toward his motorcycle and adjusted the gloves resting on the seat. Angela watched him for a moment before speaking again. "I am glad you were here today," she said quietly. Marcus swung one leg over the motorcycle and started the engine, the familiar deep rumble filling the air once more. "Sometimes the right person just happens to be passing through," he replied with a small smile. Then he glanced once more toward the playground where Lily had already run back toward the swings, laughing as if the frightening moment had never existed. Marcus nodded slightly to Angela and guided the motorcycle toward the road, leaving Maplewood Community Park peaceful once again. The deep rumble of Marcus Dalton's motorcycle slowly faded down Maple Street as he rode away from Maplewood Community Park, leaving behind a neighborhood that had quietly returned to its normal rhythm. The late afternoon sun had begun dipping lower toward the desert hills, painting the playground with warm orange light. Children were laughing again on the swings and climbing bars as if the frightening tension from earlier had already become a distant memory. Lily Brooks pumped her legs on the swing set with renewed energy, her yellow dress fluttering in the breeze, while Angela Brooks watched from the nearby bench. Yet even as the park returned to normal, Angela knew that the events of that afternoon would stay with her for a very long time. A few days later, the truth about Victor Hale began to unfold more clearly. The memory cards taken from the Suburban were examined by investigators at the county station. What they discovered confirmed the suspicions Marcus had felt the moment he saw the camera inside the vehicle. The photographs stored on those cards showed several parks and playgrounds across neighboring counties. Some images had been taken from long distances using the powerful zoom lens, focusing on specific playgrounds at certain hours of the day. The notebook found on the passenger seat contained careful observations about when families usually visited different parks and which playgrounds were busiest in the afternoons. It also included notes about school dismissal times and weekend activity schedules. Investigators quickly realized that Victor had been traveling from town to town documenting patterns in public places where children gathered. Because of the evidence collected from the Suburban, the county police department contacted law enforcement agencies in nearby states where Victor had previously been questioned. Within days, additional reports began connecting similar sightings of the same vehicle near playgrounds and elementary schools. The information helped authorities reopen several investigations that had stalled months earlier. While the legal process continued, Maplewood Community Park remained peaceful. Parents in the neighborhood became more attentive to unfamiliar vehicles near the playground, and the story of what had happened spread quietly through the community. Many of them spoke about the moment when Angela trusted her instinct and decided to speak up instead of ignoring the uneasy feeling in her chest. Others talked about the calm biker who had listened carefully and taken the situation seriously when no one else yet realized what might be happening. One evening about 2 weeks after the incident, Angela returned to the park with Lily just as the sun was setting behind the hills. The playground was quieter than usual, and the air carried the gentle scent of desert sage drifting across the grass. As Lily ran toward the swings, Angela noticed a familiar motorcycle parked along the far curb near the diner across the street. Marcus Dalton stood beside it, adjusting the strap of his helmet before preparing to ride away. When he noticed Angela watching him, he gave a small friendly wave. Angela walked closer and thanked him again for everything that had happened that afternoon. Marcus listened quietly before answering in the same calm voice. She remembered. "The important thing is that your daughter is safe and the community is paying attention now." Angela nodded and glanced toward Lily laughing on the swing. Marcus followed her gaze for a moment before speaking again. "A peaceful park should always stay a peaceful place for children," he said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is one person noticing something unusual and deciding not to ignore it." Angela smiled and agreed. As Marcus started his motorcycle and rode away once more, the soft rumble of the engine echoed briefly across Maplewood Community Park. And as the sound faded into the distance, Lily's laughter filled the evening air, a simple reminder that the safest communities are built when ordinary people choose to look out for one another.